So really when Jesus said that, and what he was talking to was about relationships. And therefore, you know, if you do not forgive somebody, you live in the torment of your own unforgiveness. It doesn't mean that God hasn't forgiven you. He's forgiven everyone, everything. So, and also when Jesus was talking, he was talking to people under the law, not people living under grace. So we got to understand that most of his audience were living under the old covenant. Therefore, he was talking to them in terms of the old covenant most of the time.
Okay.
And actually under the old covenant, you had a lot of things, but he did say, look, you've heard it said, in other words, this is what the old covenant says, but I'm going to say something different to you. And I'm going to say there's a better way or a different way. So when it talks about unforgiveness, you have, 2 Corinthians 5:19, God has reconciled himself, through Jesus, reconcile all things to himself, not counting their sin or trespass against them. You've got to reconcile that under the new covenant and realize that God doesn't hold anything against anybody. But if a person chooses to live in unforgiveness, they will live with the consequences of what they're sowing. If you sow unforgiveness, you're going to reap something negative. That's just the principle of sowing and reaping. Does God want you to reap something negative? No, because you actually can be forgiven and you can have mercy, and that mercy then has to be reciprocated to other people. Because the parable of the unforgiving servant was, I've forgiven you everything, and you didn't forgive one person one day. I've forgiven you the gross national debt of Israel, and yet you won't forgive someone one day's wages. If that's the way you want to do it, you will live with the consequence of your unforgiveness, and it will be like being in the torture chamber. And so, even though I've forgiven you, it will be like I haven't, from your perspective. But from mine, God's forgiven everybody and holds nothing against anybody. But people don't live from that perspective. When they choose to live in their own unforgiveness, it creates torment for their lives, and they will reap the consequences of living in unforgiveness, physically, emotionally, in every way. Even to some people who physically are suffering sickness because that unforgiveness has triggered sickness within their body. Because we're not designed to live in unforgiveness. Our body cannot cope with unforgiveness. And therefore physical sickness can take place when someone's living. And actually most sickness, people believe, has come from some sort of stressor. And unforgiveness is one of the biggest stressors. Anger, unforgiveness, bitterness, resentment is a huge stressor on the physical body.
Yeah.
And our whole being can be affected by that, which is really what it was talking about, in not being forgiven. It just means you're not going to live in the forgiveness that is actually yours if you do not choose to forgive. That's really the context of it. Nothing to do with eternal forgiveness. It was like, this is what you live in now. You're living in torment in the torture chamber now. Nothing to do with hell or anything after death. It's now that you live in that. And most people suffer the consequences of their behavior and life now. And I think no one gets away with anything.